In 2011, a NATO-led coalition militarily intervened in Libya, helping anti-government fighters remove longtime leader Muammar Gaddafi. And today, Libya is a bit of a mess. And a lot of that has to do with its relationship with the United States. When Libya first became an independent country in 1951, self-appointed King Idris I welcomed British and American military bases on Libyan soil in exchange for aid. Some years later, oil reserves were discovered and foreign companies moved in to extract and profit. And sure, Libya benefited, but at the price of its own economic independence. So in came an army officer by the name of Muammar Gaddafi, who, in 1969, overthrew King Idris. His vision? A Libya for the Libyans, by the Libyans. Gaddafi was feeling the pan-Arabist socialist fever that was overtaking the region in the 1960s. He wanted Libya to be economically independent. And the way to do it? Seize the means of production. Oil production, that is. Foreign military bases were shut down and the National Oil Corporation was established. And 1973 turned out to be a pretty busy year. Gaddafi attempted to nationalize oil, demanding that all foreign companies negotiate new contracts that would benefit Libya, or get out. Gaddafi also used Libya's oil as a political bargaining chip. The Arab-Israeli war was raging, and Libya introduced an oil embargo against any country supporting Israel. And it didn't take long for OPEC countries to follow suit and basically create an international panic, especially in the United States. The 70s ended with the U.S. listing Libya as a, quote, state sponsor of terrorism after a mob set fire to a U.S. embassy in Tripoli. In the 80s, Ronald Reagan's presidency meant a stronger foreign policy towards an anti-Israel, pro-Soviet Libya.
Today, we have done what we had to do. If necessary, we shall do it again.
In addition to sanctions, Reagan authorized the bombing of Tripoli and Benghazi. The move was in retaliation for a 1986 attack on a German nightclub that killed and injured dozens of U.S. servicemen. In 1988, Libya was accused of being behind the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland. 270 people were killed. Libya refused to cooperate with UN investigations, and that meant everyone's favorite political tool, more sanctions. Then in the late 90s and early 2000s, Libya began taking steps towards opening up a bit more. In 2003, UN sanctions were lifted after Libya accepted responsibility for the Lockerbie bombing and agreed to pay $2.7 billion in compensation to the victims' families. Shortly after, Libya took even more steps to shrug off its image as a dangerous state, working with the United Nations to prove that it wasn't interested in developing weapons of mass destruction. The United States took notice and lifted sanctions from Libya and also tried to normalize relations. And part of that normalization? Oil. In January 2005, Libya allowed U.S. companies in for oil exploration, the first time since U.S. companies left in 1986. And a year later, probably coincidentally, the U.S. took Libya off of its state sponsors of terrorism list. And while this was happening, Libyans were getting fed up. They were fed up with decades of Gaddafi's brutal rule and with waiting for the oil wealth to trickle down. So in 2011, along with the rest of the region, Libya erupted in protests. Thousands came out into the streets of Benghazi in February of that year against Gaddafi's autocratic rule. Protests were met with violence, and the situation quickly became a bloody civil war between forces loyal to Gaddafi and rebel groups. And less than a month later, the UN approved a NATO-led military intervention, helping ring in a new era for Libya. But that new era hasn't looked so hot. Intervening powers didn't come to Libya with a plan, and while elections did take place in 2012, the country has since only deteriorated. Warring militias, contested leadership, decreased oil output, and ISIS have all led to the country's collapse. And now the U.S. has resumed military strikes in Libya, this time against ISIS. So will Libya ever be allowed to stand on its own?